Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. Greetings and welcome, Tobias. Fantastic to have you on the podcast show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Now, before we go into the meat of our conversation, I'd love to learn something about your origin story. What did you study at university, and was it inevitable you'd end up in economics, politics, Japan, in the world you're in at the moment?
Inevitable might be a strong word, but it does feel like I've been maybe on the path that I've been on for a long time. So I went to Brandeis University outside of Boston, was a politics and history major, and started studying the Japanese language like my first day of university, because the summer before I started university, I got interested in Japanese literature and had studied German for years, and then I was like, nope, I want to do Japanese. And so started studying the language, and then it was just a question of, okay, I'm already interested in politics. How do I put, the language and the politics together? And so just kept working at that. And then
it's interesting, Japan, I can imagine if you look younger, so I imagine you weren't around in the 80s, like at uni, but in the 80s, I can imagine people thinking about Japanese, as a language, but today it'll be more like Mandarin or Chinese. But why pick Japan? It doesn't seem like quite the kind of the growth area that, people once had back in the 80s and that period.
I feel like that's the question that I got through my entire education, right? The early 2000s, it was, of course, everyone's learning China, everyone's learning Mandarin. Why not Mandarin? That obviously is the more sensible choice. And really it started as really an aesthetic preference. I really wanted to read the literature in the original, after reading literature in translation. And but I think then, as I really thought about, okay, well, politically, what does this mean? Of course, the U.S.-Japan relationship in the early 2000s was going through a bit of a renaissance and a resurgence. And just, in passing, this was really the moment. 2000, you had the famous Armitage and I report, whose principal co-authors both died in the last several months. So, there was energy there, because I think, and this became very apparent, right, that as concerns about China grew, the U.S.-Japan relationship was discovering value that in the first decade after the Cold War, people were wondering, is this relationship going to endure? Is there really enough value here? And, it was pretty clear that there was, it was going to be more important, and that Japan was committed to changing in ways that I think have only become more apparent in recent years. And I think it is noteworthy that, whereas 15 or 20 years ago, it was constantly being asked, why Japan, why not China? No one asked that question anymore. I think the answer to that has now become obvious in ways that 20 years ago, I don't think it was quite so obvious.
And I noticed in terms of your background that you spent time in Japan, like knocking on doors on political campaigns, which is quite unusual even for Japanophiles. Like, I haven't heard many people who've gone kind of that into the weeds of politics there. Most people who cover Japan politics tend to be much more kind of in academic departments and look on from high above. But you seem to be, kind of grassroots type level of interactions you had.
So, I think there's been a steady, I could not tell you the numbers now, but really even back since, the 80s, when Japan really had its moment in the sun, you had a kind of steady trickle of foreigners going and working for Diet members, that they liked having someone, there were certain Diet members who were more internationally minded, who say, look, we have our resident foreign staffer. And so there has been a number of people who've done it. So I'm by no means alone. It was, a useful experience. It was sort of a very hands-on way of learning about Japanese politics. And in fact, I was working for a Diet member before I had taken a single hour of a formal academic class about Japanese politics, which I didn't do until years after that. So, I really learned on the ground and really learned, kind of the texture of Japanese politics, from, kind of as a practical area of study before it was an academic area of study. So, I mean, I would recommend that for anyone interested in that, find a Diet member who wants, and there's certain Diet members who, pretty consistently have, foreign graduate students come and work, for a time in their offices. And it's a really useful way of understanding Japanese politics in ways that books can't necessarily communicate.
Now, I did want to talk about like what's going on in Japan right now, how they interact with China and the US and so on. But when I look at Japan, it still seems as though the shadow of Shinzō Abe still looms large in Japanese politics. It seems like he sort of disrupted Japanese politics, created a new paradigm, and all the subsequent prime ministers have kind of been working within that paradigm. So number one, do you think that's a fair sort of observation? And then secondly, why was Abe, what did he do that was so disruptive?
So, well, maybe the second part first, that Abe in a lot of ways was, so maybe stepping back even bigger picture. I mean, so, Japan, you have eras that are defined by the reigning emperor. So the previous era, right now you're in the Reiwa era. The previous era was the Heisei era. And, the theme of, arguably the kind of overriding theme of the Heisei era was, this period of crisis, the economic crisis starting, right after you had a change of emperor in 1989, the bubble burst and you have prolonged economic stagnation. You had, several major natural disasters. You had corruption scandals. I mean, it was a period really where it felt like, the regime that had built Japan into, a strong, modern, wealthy country had reached its usefulness, and the problems were evident in all directions. And the response to that was, we need to build a new type of top-down political system that can react more decisively in the face of crisis, that can can really push ahead reform. And that was, so you had, really decades of political reform aimed at producing a more top-down system. And so Abe, essentially in 2012, when he comes back, is both a product of those reforms, as, basically recognizing, okay, that we need, sort of more decisive leadership, leadership with vision, and also a driver of those reforms, and had been earlier in his career. And then after he comes back in 2012, really kind of puts some of the last pieces into place. Creates a National Security Council, strengthens the central government's control over bureaucratic appointments, which really has had, I think, a lot of influence throughout the system in ways that are not always visible. And then, of course, also, really pushes ahead with policies to address prolonged economic stagnation. And so you put all of that together, and so in some ways he's sort of the culmination of several decades of trying to change how the Japanese political system works, and as a result, really gets this, historically long tenure to use those tools to try to change the government, to change policy, to really make Japan feel like it had put its period of stagnation behind it.
And just a question on that, what that kind of talks to, at least the pre-Abe, the pre-Abe 2.0 sort of phase, was that Japanese politics is very sort of consensus seeking. So you have these LDP generally sort of leads the pack. You have these smaller parties, and people, they bring consensus, and then you implement the policy. And so what was it kind of structurally within Parliament that, like, you said they were trying to move more towards a top-down sort of way of working, and then Abe presumably took advantage of that and consolidated that. But what was it specifically that allowed the prime minister or the cabinet to have more power?
So, really started, the reforms really started with changing the electoral system in the early 1990s, where, you'd had this system that, the kind of consensus is that it encouraged factionalism, You had bigger districts with multiple candidates representing, and so you'd actually end up with multiple LDP candidates from the same district, which encouraged intra-party competition. And so you moved in the early 1990s to a system where it's now mixed between first past the post single member districts and some proportional representation constituencies, which in some ways favors the LDP in that it enables smaller parties to survive. Even if they can't win the single member districts, they can still hang on in proportional representation. So, essentially kind of divides the opposition. And meanwhile, the LDP is very strong in single member districts across the country. And so, it's been very, I mean, you had a brief period of kind of proper two-party competition from about 2000 to 2012, but for most of the last 30 years the story has been the LDP has been strong, and you've had a lot of other opposition parties that have been divided and struggled to coalesce into a unified second party. I might sneeze in a moment, so
That's fine. That's fine. We'll kind of edit that one out.
So that was and so changing to a more to an electoral system that had more first past the post, more majoritarianism, was supposed to encourage kind of more centralized parties, less factionalism, parties that were differentiated on policy, make it more Westminster. The goal was really something much more Westminster, kind of textbook Westminster system, right? Where you have two parties differentiated sort of on ideological grounds. You could kind of have this like pure clash of ideas and ideologies, and the prime minister and an opposition leader, and they would clash, and they would have prime minister's questions, and that was sort of the vision. And it's never entirely gotten there, but it's become much more of a Westminster style system than it had been, where during the heyday of LDP rule, it was much more balkanized, much more factionalized, much more, basically what you had was almost collusion between the bureaucracy and kind of representatives of various interest groups within the LDP sort of working together to make policy, and this idea that the prime minister wasn't, really a chief executive. The prime minister was sort of the head of of this sort of loose coalition and sort of trying to herd cats, and it was always this kind of slog to control the LDP, because ultimately everyone was sort of doing their own thing, and you ended up with not a whole lot of coherence ultimately, as a result, and a lot of corruption and a lot of just sort of backroom dealing, and that was the LDP for much of its history. That was the story, and so wanting to move away from that was really the response to the challenges of of the Heisei era.
And Abe, his famous or signature policy was the three arrows, which even Scott Bessent, today's Treasury Secretary, makes reference to. First of all, what were the three arrows? Like, genuinely, what were they? I mean, there's the hype, monetary, fiscal, structural, and did they work or not?
So of course, first arrow, we all, monetary policy, unconventional, next dimension, as Kuroda called it, monetary stimulus, which, of course, over time, sort of this like unfolding variations on a theme, right? First, we got just sort of normal QQE, and then, negative interest rates, and then yield curve control, just sort of constantly, trying to reflate the economy. And that, how do you get people who are accustomed to deflation to expect inflation and to act as if inflation is going to happen, and then, get this virtuous cycle, which you're still hearing about from Japanese policymakers. So that was first and foremost. And of course, the most visible policy change, and certainly maybe the biggest departure from what the Bank of Japan had been doing before. And so, that I think,
I mean, I mean, was there some loss of BOJ independence, would you say? Like, I mean, it seemed like it's the politicians who are saying this is one of the arrows is we want to tell
Right.
the central bank what they should be doing. So it feels, like there's some loss of independence there. I mean, is that an unfair criticism or?
No, I mean it was sort of a dance, right? And the way I kind of understood it was that there was sort of a trade of, um, the bank's de jure independence would be safeguarded, and Abe took power threatening, basically like if the Bank of Japan did not change course, that there would be threats to the bank's de jure independence. Um, but there was, considerable loss of de facto independence, that ultimately, the bank, was responding to political signals from the Abe government. And, this is what we wanted. You know, like your goal is going to be, to produce reflation. That is, and the bank's policy board was packed with reflationist allies, people loyal to what the government wanted. I mean, so there was a real sense of um, you know, like this is the policy goal. We are setting it, from the government is setting the direction. You have your um, independence to figure out how to achieve that goal, but you are now an adjunct of essentially what we are trying to achieve for Japan's economy. And so, I mean, clearly there was a sense of um, less than full independence, let's say. And I think, one of the storylines, I think, for the moment now is in some ways the BOJ trying to claw back some of that independence. That as it um, normalizes policy, part of that project of, you know, winding back some of the unconventional monetary policies is the bank trying to, um, as it, okay, now we are moving back in sort of our traditional role of, like we're reverting to short-term interest rates as our primary tool. We're going to step back from controlling the market for Japanese government debt. Like that we're going to move back into a familiar role. We're not taking our orders from what the government necessarily wants us to do. Um, and I think we're, um, it's tricky to kind of follow that because it's not a straightforward process. Clearly the fact that the global economy is in a period of extreme uncertainty is complicating that process as well. Um, but in general, that seems to be the theme, that normalization means the Bank of Japan reasserting some of the independence that was curtailed during the Abe years.
And then on the second arrow, the fiscal side, I mean, Japan's been mired with fiscal problems before Abe since then. I mean, was there a genuine change on the fiscal side, or was it just the justification for just running further deficits?
Well, so the story, the phrasing they used was flexible fiscal policy, right? And so in 20, and which meant different things at different times. So when Abe came in, in early 2013, the idea was, we are doing monetary stimulus and big fiscal stimulus at the same time. Um, in practice, you ended up getting this kind of stop start where you were, raising, the consumption tax rate, but then shelving consumption tax, the consumption tax increase, multiple times and pushing it back several years. Um, you had consumption tax or corporate tax cuts. So it was not, the signal was not always clear. I will say, I think though the biggest difference that we saw, even if, yes, Abe did raise the consumption tax twice. What you did have change, I think, though, the LDP, during those years went from being a party, that in 2009 and in 2012, was campaigning as a party of fiscal responsibility, of, we're going to raise the consumption tax. We're going to, we're really committed to, um, fiscal sustainability. And I think what happened over the Abe years was that commitment actually weakened, and particularly on the right wing of the LDP, on Abe's part of the LDP, um, there became a much more ideological commitment to fiscal dovishness, so that by the time Abe was assassinated in 2022, I mean, he almost had become, almost an advocate for modern monetary theory. And I mean, there are people now, on the right wing of the LDP who are open advocates for modern monetary theory. Basically, deficits don't matter. The textbooks are wrong. We can run bigger deficits for longer than anyone thought, and we have urgent needs in the near term, and so we shouldn't sacrifice. If we have to raise defense spending, and if we have to run bigger deficits to do that, then we should do that, and we shouldn't worry about it. And everything is
just
fine.
as a sort of a side note, why do you think Japan has been able to run such high debt levels without it running into a crisis? I mean, this has always been the puzzle for all the fiscal hawks, the academics and so on. Japan's always the exception that you kind of just have in the background there, and you don't want to really engage with it, and somehow Japan just seems to get away with it.
Well, it helped that for the last 12 years, the Bank of Japan has dominated the market for Japanese government debt, right? Controlling more than 50, owning more than 50% of outstanding debt, that you essentially like, and having yield curve control where, essentially you don't have, long-term yields were not freely floating, essentially. That helped a lot. And so, and of course, before that, the fact that you almost had, essentially financial repression, right? Or whether it was formal or not, the fact that, so much of government debt was being held by the GPIF, by other pension funds, by other sort of domestic investors, that helped, I think, suppress yields as well. I mean, I think the interesting question now is, okay, if the Bank of Japan wants to reduce its holdings, and certainly is not buying as much, but if the government is, continuing to run deficits, still, issuing a lot of new debt, who's buying that? And are you going to see, big domestic investors come back into Japanese government debt? Are they going to, after, and it certainly doesn't look like that right now, right? I mean, the GPIF, diversified into riskier holdings, moving more into foreign equities, more into foreign bond holding. They don't seem to be they're not moving back into, being sort of a backstop for JGBs. So, we have seen.
I mean, on that, actually, that's an interesting point. I mean, do you think that could? I mean, what's their rationale for that? Is that because they're like profit maximizing? I mean, they're just trying to do the best for the fund, and they don't feel there's a political constraint. I mean, can the politics change to force them to say, look, you've got to bring the money back home?
I mean, I don't know, especially because so much of the GPIF reform process during the Abe years was institutional reform, right? Professionalizing it, making it a much more, bringing it to global standards, making it an organization that was much more geared towards, we need returns, for pensioners, and ensuring that we're meeting our obligations, and we're gonna be much more much more professionally minded. That's gonna be hard to return to. Like, we're basically before, it essentially was a bunch of bureaucrats, and they didn't have to really think about what returns they were generating, and they weren't that wasn't their background, that wasn't their mindset. You've professionalized the fund now. You're not necessarily going to be able to just flip the switch and go back to that. I mean, and so far, I mean, that's what we're seeing. And so, I don't know if they really have the wherewithal to make funds go back to that. You've had them adopt, the stewardship code. I mean, there's a much more professional orientation in all of these.
And actually, on the stewardship code, I mean, that kind of, in some ways, comes under the third arrow in terms of institutional and governance reforms. You also have a take that the third arrow shouldn't be viewed as simply deregulation and like a push for the private sector to take over. I mean, what
Yeah.
is your take on the third arrow?
Yeah, well, I mean, the standard take on the third arrow, of course, is that I mean, it wasn't one thing. It was it was more darts than arrow, as there was sort of, and I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, I think the argument I've had with lots of people though that over the years is that I think the third arrow was where we saw Abe's inclinations that, Abe was a statist or a neo-statist. This was not, small government, like let's get, like the third arrow is taking the government out of the business of governing the economy. And actually, it was, it was industrial policy and trying to shift economic activity into higher value added sectors. And they basically threw everything at the wall, right? And looking for what sticks. So, sure, was that deregulation one of the tools? Yeah, absolutely. But tax incentives, subsidies,
All the green tech stuff, the
just,
chip
yeah, I
stuff,
mean, just,
yeah,
I
the
mean,
whole
they're just,
thing. Yeah.
like just whatever worked. So it was a lot of different things. Some of those things worked better than others. You could say, some of it was trade policy, right? We're going to do TPP. We're going to do an FTA with the EU. We're going to, market creation, trying to find business opportunities abroad for Japanese companies. I mean, it was never just one thing. It was,
But it was statist, though. That was the key thing. It was
yes,
like active, kind of industrial, economic, but it wasn't like they were going to step back.
Yeah, it wasn't,
That's a misnomer.
yeah. I mean, I think, that, sometimes it was convenient, I think, for Abe to say that to certain audiences, that the third arrow is deregulation, the third arrow is, freeing animal spirits. But that was never, I don't think you could ever really say that was what it was about. It was really a METI driven, we're going to try, different industrial policies with the goal of, how do we move capital? How do we allocate capital to areas where there's more growth? How do we encourage labor to move to areas where there's more growth? It was much more hands-on, trying to shape the structure of Japan's economy and where growth was going to be generated rather than just, we're going to step back and let the market do its thing.
And now we have the Prime Minister Ishiba. Before that, it was Kishida who but Ishiba now, I mean, how would you characterize him and the government? How does he relate to these three arrows? I mean, is he a disciple of Abe? Is his own? Does he have a whole different vision? Can you tell us a bit more about him?
Yeah, so Ishiba was, during Abe's second government, was the anti-Abe. He was a thorn in Abe's side for a while. Abe beat him in 2012 to come back. Ishiba ran against him in 2018. Ishiba was often the loudest critic of Abenomics within the LDP. And basically, his line was, you're stimulating growth, but this is just growth as sort of stimulus as a narcotic. There's not really, you're not really fundamentally changing kind of long-term growth trajectory of Japan. And you once that stimulus is withdrawn, we're still going to have the same kind of structural problems about demographics as a constraint, and kind of long-term stagnation will still be with us. And so he was criticized the first arrow. And his other, he's from, one of the smallest, most rural prefectures in Japan. And so his line has always been about, we need to figure out a way to ensure that there aren't parts of the country being left behind. It's okay, so great, if Tokyo's growing, if Nagoya is growing, if Osaka is growing, but that's not good enough, that there's too many people being left behind by Abenomics. And that's also been his theme, but he's never actually not unlike Abe before 2012 was not the most sophisticated thinker as far as macroeconomics is concerned. It's hard to see what he doesn't exactly have I think a particularly sophisticated set of ideas about moving away from his views. his views on monetary policy normalization. I don't know if he really has anything all that sophisticated. I mean, he seems to be, in general, seems to be interested in fiscal sustainability and is actually somewhat to a surprising extent, given his political weakness, seems to be committed to spending political capital on really moving in the direction of, reducing budget deficits and really trying to put Japan's finances on a more sustainable footing. That seems to
And
be
that's
his approach.
manifested. There was recently this talk about a consumption tax cut, and he
Yeah.
seems to have shelved that, as far as I can
Yeah.
tell.
So he shelved that, and then last month, when the impact of Trump tariffs was first landing, his response, there was a lot of calls for, we need a big stimulus package, the economic hit's going to hurt. And he said, we are not doing one. We're going to, well, one, because we don't know the impact ultimately. And two, like we don't have, I don't want to prematurely abandon this this push for fiscal sustainability. And
I mean,
so
what's your rationale? I mean, what's your thinking? I mean, why is he more conservative on fiscal than his predecessors, do you think? I mean, what's the pressure points for him to? It sounds like he, as you said, he's expending political capital, so there is some, ideology.
there's a cost,
there's a
yeah.
viewpoint there.
I mean, because arguably, he's got, you face an election in 3 months. His political situation isn't great. You would think, just the surest way to make friends and influence people, would be to take out that old LDP pork barrel spending playbook and splash money around, and he's not doing that. And so, some of it is, I think, I think everyone is a little spooked by, interest rates are rising, and Japan has, the government has been able to, kind of survive, with low, not having to worry about interest payments, growing. And I think there is a concern that if they don't act now, the pain from that is only going to grow, and you're only going to see debt servicing costs increase. And, so looking at, the kind of projections from the Ministry of Finance, some of it, I think, might just be, when you have political weakness, sometimes the finance ministry feels its power growing. And so Ishiba, this might even be less Ishiba himself and more kind of deferring to the finance ministry's voice at this moment, that they're kind of arguing very loudly and insistently that that debt servicing costs need to be corralled now, and we can't wait, and we can't put it off. And the Bank of Japan wants to raise rates, and so we're gonna see higher interest rates, and so we have to move now. And Abe, was he did battle with the finance ministry and was strong enough to push back against them. His tenure was not a good set of years for the finance ministry for the most part. Particularly after after Abe agreed to the first round of consumption tax increase in 2013, and they raised it in 2014. And you got a mini recession. Abe felt really burned by that, and really pushed back against the finance ministry. And since he left office in 2020, you've had, and the prime ministers have been a little weaker. You have seen the finance ministry's power grow again compared to what happened during.
And does Ishiba have a view on the BOJ? Obviously, they've been raising rates, hawkish. I mean, not hawkish anymore, but I mean they seem to be going on hold now. But did he have, or does he have a view on the monetary side of things?
Well, so of course, as I said, he was very critical of monetary stimulus during the Abe years. That it was a narcotic. During the LDP leadership campaign last year, and then sort of immediately afterwards, he was sort of a little more ambivalent about the speed of normalization. Now, but then, a few months ago, kind of turned back to more of his, normalization's fine. I don't have a problem with this. Like, let's let this play out. Let's respect the BOJ's independence, and that seems to be where he's landed now. But it's not. I don't think we're looking at deep conviction here. I think it's, um, in general, maybe that's his inclination, but he doesn't have really strong personal, ideas about this, and so may be inclined to defer to Ueda and follow the BOJ's lead rather than imposing a particular set of preferences.
And we've somehow sort of avoided talking about Trump and the trade war. Obviously, I should timestamp this, because you never know how things will evolve. But we're recording this on Monday, the 12th of May. Earlier today, we had the announcement that the US would have a 90-day reprieve with China with lower tariffs. So the market seems to like this. Obviously, this is fast moving, but I mean, how do you view China's reaction to what's been happening since Trump came into office for the second time?
I think China they seem to have been very patient, and in some ways, appreciating that they have a very good hand to play right now, and that, in some ways, the United States seems to need China more than the other way around, and that if you wait long enough, you can get concessions from the United States.
And would Japan view it in the same light then as well, do you think? Or do you think...
I think we're seeing some of that. There's been some reporting, and in general, the messaging from Ishiba has been, we're not going to rush into an agreement. We're not going to just make a deal to get the US off our backs, because right now the deal that's on the table is not something that's good for us. And that, ultimately, if we wait, and let kind of the impact of tariffs on the U.S. economy play out, let public opinion in the U.S. play out, let market reactions play out, that ultimately we might get a better deal later than now. And and it's particularly complicated for Japan because again, you have elections in 3 months, and Ishiba's situation isn't great at the moment, and you don't want to be, I think compared to the past, and certainly compared to Trump's first term, where I think, the public mood in Japan was, we've got to do whatever it takes to make the US happy, to make Trump happy. And, let's be reasonable, and let's, we have to get along. I think there's a little more wariness, maybe even bitterness in the of the Japanese public. I think one, there's a sense of betrayal that that there was a sort of a gentleman's agreement between Abe and Trump about if Japan agreed to open its market for certain agricultural products as part of that U.S.-Japan FTA in 2019, that Trump wouldn't raise automobile tariffs, and of course that handshake deal has been violated, and there's a real sense of how can we trust any deal we make? Why should we make further concessions to the United States when if we do that, how do we know that he's not just going to threaten again? And how can we just we can't accept 25% automobile tariffs, and so why should if those tariffs aren't on the table, why should we make further concessions? And so that's kind of where the mood is now. And
just in relation to that and the upcoming elections, who's the opposition, and what are they saying on the trade side?
So I think So the opposition, you have multiple opposition parties now. You have the Constitutional Democrats, you have the Democratic Party for the People, both of which are kind of offshoots of the former Democratic Party for Japan. You have the Osaka-based Ishin no Kai, or trying to think. I never think of what English name they use. It's always just Ishin for me. I mean, and they're, I don't want to go down to if we can go down the rabbit hole talking about their different strengths and weaknesses. I mean, I think, mainly they are focusing their fire on the domestic economic conditions, so
Okay.
lots of talk about cost of living increases, ensuring that, questioning about Ishiba's approach to addressing some of those impacts. I mean, I think there's they're holding Ishiba's feet to his fire as far as not caving and not being too sycophantic in the talk, and it's probably stiffened Ishiba's resolve somewhat, a feeling that if he was too eager for an agreement, the costs of being too sycophantic and too eager to please could be a lot greater than the cost of holding out, even if there's some economic pain. And so I think that's what we're seeing, that there has been a feeling of standing firm, defending Japan's interest, not being too eager to please Trump, being a tough negotiator, and maybe a sense that Trump might actually respect you more if you hold out rather than being too willing to agree.
And what's Japan's relationship like with China? Obviously, Japan's has some caution around dealing with China, but it seems like the world's splitting into regional blocks. You have like the US who's saying like, we're looking after our backyard. We're no longer going to be the global policeman. You guys deal with stuff yourself. So suddenly you're there with the big brother in the region, China. So how does Japan engage with China? Obviously Korea as well, Taiwan. They're this whole kind of regional sort of block.
So it's still not an easy relationship, and you had, during and immediately after COVID, I mean, I think, really a deep freeze in the relationship where, the governments were almost weren't even talking, that political ties have attenuated, military tensions continue to grow. You had real trade friction growing out of China's embargo on Japan's fisheries exports related to release of treated water from Fukushima. So, not a great relationship. And you've had efforts over the last year now to try to rebuild some of those political ties. You've had a lot of exchange, trips back and forth at, very senior levels, both government and senior politicians, going back and forth between Beijing and Tokyo, just trying to kind of reset things and get back to where things were in 2019. But the big picture is, Japan does not want to decouple from China. And I think the reality is, yeah, okay, the United States, and frankly, the United States is maybe recognizing they don't want to decouple from China either. But look, you might be willing to entertain those fantasies, but, China's not next door to you. And, Japan, they recognize, that they have to live with China one way or the other. It's not always going to be easy. And it's, there are real dangers from China's military power, real, threats from Chinese economic coercion. I mean, all of that is, not far from front of mind for Japanese policymakers, but you still have to live with China. And, Japanese corporate Japan wants to be in China. It's, too important a market for them to not be in.
And we've had these other like Quad and all these other alliances, India, Australia, Korea, the different sort of permutations to kind of implicit behind those is to create a bloc against China, or to kind of not against, but like to create a more powerful bloc that can face up to China. I mean, do you think that those things could still work or not, or are we past that now? Is this a different environment?
I mean, I think there's still value for that in that, to the extent that, countries in the region aren't looking, they're not looking to be dominated by China. They want to be able to trade with China and have Chinese investment and economic relations with China, but they don't want to be coerced and they don't want to be, um, they don't want to be vassals. And to the extent that Japan's economic and political power, um, it helped those countries have more choices. There's a place for that. Um, but, I think, Japan, um, the kind of major principle of Abe's approach to the region and to the world was, we need the United States engaged. The United States has to be committed, to regional security and to economic rulemaking. I mean, that was what TPP was, right? We need the United States, committed to the region, um, invested in, um, shaping an economic order in the region that was not China dominated. Um, Clearly, that is a lot harder without, with the United States not doing that. Um, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible or that there's not, clearly, um, TPP has value as a platform for rulemaking and for, for stitching together um, a lot of different economies. Now we're seeing, the possibility of kind of bringing the EU and TPP together somehow as sort of a um, alternative pathway to um, advancing trade and investment integration. So there's clearly, Japan has um, a lot of influence in a lot of different ways in the region, as a rule maker, as an investor, as a provider of, development assistance, increasingly as a provider of security assistance. Um, it is not a substitute for the United States, I think, just in terms of weight, and I think Japan knows that. Um, nor nor is it a one for one alternate to China. I mean, because just, in terms of just the sheer scale, um, they know that they can't provide that. They cannot, you can't go to a country and say, stop taking money from China. And we'll backstop all of your needs. Um, but I think, clearly there's an appreciation in Tokyo that it has influence. It is respected. Countries want, they want Japanese investment. They want Japanese assistance. They want, um, Japan as a partner engaged in supporting them. And, that's a role that Japan has increasingly stepped into, and particularly in Southeast Asia. And we have seen in recent weeks, that, Ishiba, used Golden Week to travel to, Vietnam and the Philippines. Kishida was just in Indonesia and Malaysia. I mean, this is, we are seeing, pretty sustained engagement in Southeast Asia. Even of course, as China is doing the same thing, to say, you're not alone. We're here. We're still committed. Um, we want, we want to prevent um, outright Chinese domination of the region, and we're going to do our best to try to complicate that. Maybe is the way to think about it.
And there was some chatter about Japan threatening to sell treasuries as part of the trade negotiations. I mean, do you put any weight to that?
And it's already been walked back, right? I mean, within a couple of days, Kato was walking that back. I mean, I think it was a useful signal, not because I thought Japan um, was gonna seriously do that, because of the cost, the pain that would cause for Japan. I think was something that they were not prepared to do. Um, I think as a signal of resolve, I think it was meaningful. That look, we're not, we're not messing around in these talks. Like we are not gonna just roll over and give you, and whatever you want. I think maybe sending that signal, even if there was the threat itself was implausible. Yeah, I've seen some people suggest the possibility that it maybe had more to do with Finance Minister Kato's own political aspiration than anything else. Trying to show that he can be tough. But no, I don't think that was a serious threat in the court, in these negotiations, that Japan was going to unload its treasury holdings.
And I just wanted to round off with the upcoming elections. I mean, what are the sort of probable scenarios for the election in your eyes?
Well, there's a preliminary question, which is, we don't know yet if there's going to be if it'll just be an upper house election, or if somehow we will wind up with a double election where you get a snap lower house election to coincide with the upper house election. At this point, that might be more in the hands of the opposition than the government, because because you have a minority government. I mean, if the opposition parties all agreed, they could pass a no confidence motion that would essentially force a snap election. So we can't rule out that possibility. It's too early to say for sure if we're going to see that, but the possibility exists. So in that case, essentially you have 4 outcomes. That the LDP and Koweito retake a majority in the lower house, protect a majority in the upper house, and basically you go back to a much more stable situation. You could end up in a situation where they retain their majority in the upper house, but can't regain a majority in the lower house, and then you have exactly what we have now. The real chaos situation is if they lose majorities in both houses, and then it's, sort of a race as to who can build a coalition faster, and what sort of messy coalition you get out of that.
Is that a possibility, that scenario?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And then, you end up, maybe the least likely scenario is where you get, they regain a majority in the lower house, but lose a majority in the upper house. So, but what I think the likelihood after the election, let's just assume that there's going to be, let's assume there's no snap election. It's just an upper house election. Then it's just a question of, does the government retain control of the upper house or not? They currently have a 16-seat majority, which doesn't sound like a lot, but this is a 242-seat chamber. It's the upper house electoral system is fairly proportional, so that 16-seat can be that actually is a bigger majority than it seems. It, like in 2007 you had a big swing, but otherwise swings of that nature generally have not happened. The upper house is also relatively more biased towards rural Japan, where the LDP, has some inbuilt advantages. And so it's not a guarantee. It is not just because the government is unpopular, just because the LDP has been polling a little worse than historically. It is not a guarantee that you're actually going to see a loss of control of the upper house. If they lose control of the upper house, you're going to end up, just in a chaos situation. But even either way, whatever happens, I think what's going to happen after the upper house elections is that you're going to have a renewed effort, by the LDP to find a coalition partner from one of these 3 major opposition parties to create a more stable situation in the lower house, where you have a reliable majority for the government. And the question is, which of the opposition parties is going to be the most reliable partner in those negotiations, and the most trustworthy partner in government, right? You don't want to bring someone in government who's going to be constantly threatening to leave, who's going to make a lot of demands that just make, intra-coalition negotiations impossible. You're still not looking at, look, the fundamental difference is, the political stability of the Abe years, I don't think is coming back after these elections, where you had, the LDP and Koweito having this enormous majority in both houses, being able to do whatever they wanted, within, within sort of the limits of intra coalition politics, basically that anything they decided they wanted to do, they could do. Um, that's not the situation you're in now because of this minority government situation. Um, you're not gonna get a return to that sort of dominance, LDP-led government dominance. The situation is going to continue to be messy. The kind of ambitious policy change is not really in the cards in these kind of circumstances, where everything is going to, there's so much more negotiation now. There's so much more compromise. That's not going to change after the upper house elections.
Okay, great. Now, I just wanted to round off with a few personal questions. One is that I ask all our guests. We do have some youngsters in the audience. What advice would you give them as they go through university and they enter the real world? Many are, will graduate soon over the summer. What advice would you give them in this world that we're in at the moment?
maybe there's a lesson from my own experience. There's always a tendency to chase trends of the moment, right? I'm going to specialize, when I was in university, specialize in China, absolutely, take Mandarin, China is where it's at. And and I suppose on the whole, maybe that wouldn't have been bad, but, ultimately, focus on the thing that interests you most and don't worry so much about what the market demands are of the moment, because ultimately, in 5 or 10 years, you don't know what that's going to be, and you don't know what skills are going to be most in demand. And ultimately, you shouldn't try to guess where things are going to be in 5 or 10 years. Ultimately, find something that really consumes you, that you're really passionate about, and you want to, and that you can envision wanting to continue to do for years and years on end, because career is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, I love that. I love that advice. That's great advice there. And then on books, you obviously written a fantastic book on Shinzō Abe. What are some of the books that influence you?
My background's faded out, so you can't see all the books around me. So it's a tough question. It's a tough question to answer. I mean, on Japan in particular, I'm a big fan of Gerald Curtis is really the dean of American studies of Japanese politics. Really wrote a phenomenal book that was his PhD dissertation on Japanese political campaigning that I loved. I mean, I read when I was working for a Diet member. My former PhD advisor, Richard Samuels, has written a number of books that really influenced kind of how I think about kind of the study of Japan. I will say also read literature. I mean, I think anyone who is interested, anyone in the social sciences broadly should make a habit of reading literature, because ultimately,
Yeah.
A social scientist, your subject is people, and literature is the best technology we have for entering the minds of other people, as far as I know. That you want to enter.
And what are some of the authors that you like? You talking about contemporary? You're talking about some of the classics.
Yeah, everything, right? I mean, so I mean, as far as Japanese literature is concerned, I mean, Murakami Haruki was my kind of gateway to Japanese literature, but Mishima Kawabata, I think, more recently, there's actually been a real wave of female Japanese authors translated that really just some phenomenal works. Murata Sayaka and a number of others, just really phenomenal work being done to bring Japanese literature to English reading audiences now. So that's always worth pursuing.
That's great. I read one recently, Convenience Store Woman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is a really weird, weird.
It's so different from what you get in the West. Yeah. It's just a whole different way of writing and stuff. So it's I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so that's and literature really is also a great gateway into another country, different from your own, a culture different from your own, and so always recommend that as a way to get the feel for for individuals, and then also for cultures and societies. And so yeah, I mean, it's maybe maybe an evasive way of answering your question, but I mean,
No, that's great. That's perfect. Yeah. And then last question was, what's the best way for people to follow your work? What's if they want to reach out to you, even where should they go?
Great. I'm happy to plug. I have a Substack, Observing Japan, that is sort of the descendant of a blog, Observing Japan, that I started, but actually started when I went over to Japan to work for a Diet member, and started it originally as a log of what I was seeing and doing. And so have that Substack. That's just observingjapan.substack.com. And then for the more finance oriented, I also last year started my own business, Japan Foresight, which is more timely, forward-looking market analysis, basically political risk analysis, more aimed at investors. So, I've been following, of course, the trade talks very closely, developments with Japan's budget, fiscal policy, monetary policy, watch elections very closely. So for more finance-oriented individuals, you might check that out, japanforesight.com, and there's information there about how to contact me. And
that's great.
Appreciate hearing from people.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I'll make sure to include those in the show notes. So, with that, thanks a lot for this very engaging conversation. Good luck following the ups and downs of Japanese politics and international politics and so on. And thanks again for coming on the podcast show.
All right, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.